The recruitment terminal had been translated into 47 languages. English was not one of them. Ethan Cross stood in the middle of Vega Station's lower concourse, duffel bag over one shoulder, coffee in hand, staring at a glowing kiosk that had been flickering for the past 6 minutes. He had been trying to register for the Interstellar Freight Guild, a simple gig, haul cargo, see the galaxy, stay alive. Standard stuff for a 26-year-old human who had blown his savings on a one-way transit pass to the outer sectors. He pressed the pulsing green button. The kiosk chimed. A bright orange receipt printed from the slot. Ethan pocketed it without reading it, mostly because it was written in Vrithian script, which looked like someone had let a spider crawl through ink and then have a small emotional breakdown. He figured he'd sort it out at the front desk. The front desk, it turned out, was not a freight desk. The doors that slid open before him were tall, nearly 4 meters, and beyond them was not a cargo bay. It was a training hall. The floor was obsidian black, the walls lined with weapon racks, combat dummies, and holographic tactical displays. The air smelled like ozone and something sharper, like copper and starlight crushed together. And standing in precise formation were 43 of the most physically imposing beings Ethan had ever seen. They were female. Vrithian female, which, in practical terms, meant they stood between 2.1 and 2.4 meters tall, had dual-jointed arms built like industrial cable, luminescent amber eyes, and an aesthetic that's somewhere between apex predator and Greek statue carved from living obsidian. Their combat armor was matte black with silver rank markings. Every single one of them had a weapon on their hip. They were all staring at him. Silence. Ethan looked down at his receipt. He looked up. He looked back at his receipt. Is this not the Freight Guild? The formation didn't break. But at the far end of the hall, a figure stepped forward. She moved differently from the others, not faster, not louder, but with the kind of deliberate weight that made the air itself pay attention. Her armor bore a 3-pronged silver crest at the shoulder. Her eyes, unlike the amber of her unit, were deep violet, and they fixed on Ethan with an expression that he could not immediately categorize. It was somewhere between confused and calculating, with a thin layer of something that might, in another universe, have been amusement. "You," said Captain Valeth, "are the voluntary transfer recruit?" Ethan held up the receipt. "I think I pressed the wrong button." The Vrithian 7th Women's Combat Unit, the Velkathari, in their language, which translated roughly to those who end the argument, had a long and decorated history of rejecting recruits. Their entrance threshold was brutal. Candidates trained for 3 years before even being considered. They had never, in 400 years of operation, accepted a human. They had also never, in 400 years of operation, had a recruit show up with a coffee cup and a duffel bag and ask if he was in the right place. Captain Valeth studied the receipt. She studied Ethan. She studied the receipt again. By Vrithian military law, a signed voluntary enlistment form, even one filled out by a confused primate who had misread a kiosk, was legally binding for a minimum trial period of 30 standard days. "You will report to Barracks 7, she said finally. "At 0400. "I'm sorry, what time is it now?" 0352. Ethan stared at her. "Okay," he said. They expected him to quit by the end of the first day. The Velkathari PT routine began with a 6-kilometer run in 1.4 standard gravity, followed by combat drills, followed by a tactical simulation that had reportedly made 3 decorated Vrithian officers weep. It was designed to break candidates, not out of cruelty, but because the things the unit faced in the field were worse. Ethan ran the 6 kilometers. He didn't lead the pack. He wasn't elegant. His form, by Vrithian standards, was technically appalling. But he kept running, long after his lungs started burning, long after the other recruits, newer Vrithian candidates on their own trial track, began looking at him sideways. He ran with the grim, mechanical persistence of someone who had once worked a double shift at a shipping dock for 36 hours straight and knew the difference between can't and hasn't yet. He finished. He sat on the ground and drank the rest of his cold coffee. Lieutenant Drevesa, a weapons specialist with a scar across her left jaw and a reputation for making recruits cry through sheer silence, crouched down to his level. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked. Ethan looked up at her. "Because I hadn't finished yet." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked away without another word. The thing about humans, Captain Valeth found herself writing in her command log at the end of day 4, is that they are structurally inefficient and biologically improbable. They are too soft, too fragile, and operate best in a narrow atmospheric band. And yet. She paused. And yet. Ethan Cross had, in 4 days, done the following: completed every physical drill without complaint, albeit slowly, correctly identified a tactical flaw in simulation scenario 9 that 3 senior members had missed. He had called it the obvious door problem and seemed genuinely puzzled that no one had noticed it, accidentally diffused attention between 2 unit members by making them both laugh at something he'd said about Earth bureaucracy, and eaten whatever food the unit ate without once asking what it was. She had asked him about that last one. "Back home I once ate a gas station sandwich that had been sitting out for 6 hours, he'd said. "I have no fear left." She didn't know what a gas station was. She was beginning to feel this was important context. On day 12, the unit ran a live fire extraction drill in the station's lower simulation decks. The scenario, a downed pilot in hostile terrain, flanked on 3 sides, with a collapsing structure overhead. Ethan was assigned the role of anchor, the least critical position, usually given to the weakest team member, responsible for holding a corridor and not dying. He held the corridor. He also, without being asked, noticed that the eastern flank simulation hostile pattern had a 4-second repeat cycle, something the tactical AI had generated randomly but which had landed, coincidentally, on a predictable loop. He communicated this to the team in 8 words: east flank cycles every 4. Use it. They used it. The extraction completed 40 seconds faster than the unit's previous best. Valeth stood at the observation deck and watched the debrief unfold. Her lieutenant, Drevesa, was asking Ethan how he'd spotted the cycle. "I used to play a lot of video games," he said. "What is a video game?" "A simulation you do for fun." The entire unit went quiet. "You run simulations," said Drevesa slowly, "for entertainment?" "Since I was like 7. Another silence. "How many simulations," asked Valeth from the top of the stairs, her voice carefully neutral, "have you run?" Ethan thought about it. "Thousands, probably. Maybe more." The Velkathari exchanged a look that, translated from Vrithian body language into human terms, meant something between "oh" and "we may have made an error in our assessment." On day 30, Valeth called him into her office. The room was sparse: a desk, 2 chairs, a tactical map glowing faintly on the wall. She stood rather than sat, which Ethan had learned was a Vrithian signal of considered seriousness. "Your trial period ends today," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. You are aware that you are under no obligation to remain." "I know." She looked at him. "The unit has voted." He waited. "Unanimously," she added. "Which has not happened before, in any vote, in this unit's history." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that Ethan was starting to learn to read. "They are asking you to stay." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the freight guild. The cargo runs. The empty routes between stars, the kind of work that paid fine and meant nothing. He thought about Drevesa teaching him Vrithian blade forms with the patient focus of someone who had decided he was worth the time. About the unit's ritual pre-mission meal, where they had started, somewhere around day 10, simply handing him food without asking if he wanted it, because they already knew he'd say yes. About the way 43 Voices had, last night, called his name in the Vrithian affirmation cadence when he'd made the shot on Scenario 17. He picked up the contract form from the desk. He signed it. Valith looked at the signature. Then she looked at him. You are aware this is a 5-year commitment? Yeah. The deployment zones are classified as extreme hazard. I figured. You will be the only human in the unit. Ethan Cross set down the pen and met her violet eyes with the particular expression of a species that had crawled out of the ocean, invented fire, survived itself, and then decided to go bother the rest of the universe. Captain, he said, I've never been in the right place in my life. Might as well see what happens when I stay in the wrong one. Valith was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since he'd walked through those tall doors with a duffel bag and a cold coffee, she smiled. Welcome to the Velkathari, Recruit Cross. Outside, through the office wall, he could hear 43 soldiers beginning to cheer.